Hello good people, and welcome to another Corona tutorial. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at the new Corona tile map that got introduced in Corona 11. This thing allows you to create procedural pattern textures, and these can be then used to create bricks, paving stones, and more. But the most common use would be creating tiles, so that is what it is named after all. It has intuitive controls with which you can very comfortably create your own custom tile sets. You have control over everything from the pattern itself to the tile's color and of course things like the tile width and height, plus a plethora of other things. The idea here is that instead of modeling your tiles, the old school way, you can just create them through your materials, which can be a lot less time consuming and also in so many situations a lot less cumbersome. Now, all of this sounds really cool and great, right? But how about we take a look at some of the visual examples of some of the things you can create with the new Corona tile map. Well, here you can see we've got this nice bathroom, and the tiles you see in the bathroom, well, they're all created with the Corona tile map. Now, if we are a little bit more creative with our setups, we can come up with things such as this awesome tile pavement you see in front of you right now. This is actually a rendered image by one of our most venerable forum users, Romulus. Now, as with anything really, even this setup can be expanded. So what got added here are more noticeable gaps between the tiles, and those gaps, as you can see, have their own material as well. But hey, you can push this even further. And in this example, again, by Romulus, you can see how the tile map can also be used to define where we can scatter things. Like what was done here, where the gaps that the tile map generates were used to drive chaos scattering. So really, as you can see, there is a lot you can do with this new Corona tile map. Now in this tutorial, what we're going to do is we're going to get acquainted with the Corona tile map. We're going to look at some of its basic workflow so you understand how it works. Okay, so we've got our sort of barren floor here that we'd like to turn into a tiled floor, right? Now, the only assets that we have here are this diffuse bitmap with no tiles depicted on it, its roughness counterpart, and its normal map companion. These are all the assets that we're going to be using here, all right? Right. Okay, so first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to create a new Corona tile map, okay? And we're just going to simply plug it into the base layers texture slot in our material, okay? Now at this point, we're going to want to decide what kind of space we want the tile map to operate in. The default option is world, and this option is great if you basically want the tiles to always be in the same position in your scene, so regardless of how the object is positioned and such. So in our case here, we're going to move this floor object around, and if you take a look at interactive renderer, right, that you're going to be able to notice that the tiles will always be in the same position, right? So that's how the world space works. One important thing to note here is that the tile size you set, in our case, we're setting it in centimeters. Well, this is what the tile size will be no matter what. Okay, so right now it's at 20 by 10 centimeters. That's exactly the tiles size in our scene. All right. Okay. Now, object space here is sort of similar to world space, but this time around the tiles are mapped on a per object basis. So if we move our floor object around, right, if we rotate it, you'll see that the tiles will follow along with it. As with world space, the tile size you input in here is the exact tile size that you'll see in your scene. Although, do note one thing, and that is that if you scale your object using these parameters here, so kind of like this, well, then the tiles will scale with these parameters, with this parameter here in mind, right? But now, if you just scale up your object using the scale tool in Cinema 4D, so whenever you're not in the object mode, whenever you're in model mode and you're trying to scale things up, well, if you do scale things up like this, well, then this is just your regular object scaling up, and the tile size, as you can see, won't change. Last but not least, we have the UVW space, and this one basically depends on the actual UVW mapping that you have going on for your material / object. So in your material tag, the projection method here will be important. And if you go with, for example, UVW mapping, then obviously the UVW unwrap is going to be key for you. Now, this space is a little bit more of an advanced feature. It might not be used by that many of you because in this mode, the tile width and height and all the other parameters with units here, well, they'll basically be ratios instead of units, okay? And so by adjusting the parameters now, so for example, by adjusting the width and height parameters here, we're basically defining the ratio here of the tiles. So you can just ignore the units, all right? And so setting up your tiles like this in UVW space is a little bit trickier, but can be useful if you have objects of curved shapes. So if you have a column wall, UVW space is probably the space you're going to want to go with because object and world spaces are designed to work on planar objects, okay? Right, so with that little breakdown out of the way, the option that we're going to want to go with here in our scene is going to be the object space option. Now, the next thing that we'll want to make sure is set correctly here is the UV plane orientation, all right? So for your Y positive facing objects, you're typically going to want to go with the XZ orientation. And as soon as we switch to it, well, now, as you can see, we're starting to see some tiles. At this point, what we can do is we can simply start dialing in the desired tile size, which for us here is going to be a bit retro, I guess. So we're going to go with 20 centimeters for the width and 10 centimeters for the height. Okay. Now, that's really starting to look like something, but ideally, we'd want our tile pattern here to be rotated 90 degrees. So right now the pattern kind of goes like this, but we want it to go like this instead. So to do that, we're going to have to select our floor object and we're going to want to enable the axis modification tool. And we're going to just want to rotate the axes by 90 degrees. Okay. And look at that. That's now looking exactly as we want it to. Next thing that we're going to tweak here is going to be the gap thickness. Okay. So we can make those gaps / grouts quite large if we so want to, or, you know, we can make them just a little bit less prominent than that. Totally depends on the look you're going after. Now, just to round things off here, quite literally, I guess, we'll just ever so slightly increase the corner radius of our tiles. So if we just go with a value of, say, 3 centimeters, well, now you can see what this parameter does. It basically just increases the radius on those tile corners, right? This is a little bit much for us here. So let's just go with a more timid value of 0.1%, just so we round those corners off just ever so slightly, okay? Right, so now we got our tiles in there, but they look rather plain. They're missing all of those basic ingredients for a good material, right? They're missing the diffuse maps, the bump maps, reflection maps, etc., etc. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at next year. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to take our diffuse bitmap and we're going to plug it into our tiles tile color slot. Okay. Now, if we take a look at the rendered result here, well, then you can see that the tiles look kind of off, major leagues, right? And that is because we'll need to adjust the tile mapping in our tile maps settings. This is the parameter that will adjust how things are going to get mapped onto our tiles. And the proper setting for us here is going to be original. As soon as we switch to original, you'll be able to see that that's looking much, much better, but we can still tweak it. So in this original mode, we're going to select our material tag here. And first thing that we're going to do here is we're just going to rotate the pattern 90 degrees, or not the pattern, sorry, but the texture. We're going to rotate the texture by 90 degrees like this. Okay. And what we can also do is we can play around with the length U and V parameters to get that scale to look a little bit more the way we want it to look like. But now, how does original mapping work in the first place? Well, let's have a look. Original mapping basically takes the bitmaps you're plugging into your tile map and it simply applies them to your object according to the UVW mapping that you have going on, okay? The actual tiles are then, quote unquote, drawn on top of that using the measurements you've set in your tile map. Okay, and so that's how original mapping works. But now we have two different modes as well. So one is per tile and the other is center. So let's take a look at how those two work. And we're going to start with the per tile mode first. Per tile basically means that your bitmap is going to get mapped on a per tile basis. This is super useful for whenever you have bitmaps for your individual tiles. Now, when you opt for this type of mapping, you see this texture placement option become tweakable. And this thing gives you two options on how you can place that bitmap onto your tile. One option is crop, which just takes the bitmap size and mapping and just crops it so that it fits the tile. Stretch is the other option, and what it does is it simply takes the bitmap and it makes it fit onto your tile, even if that means stretching it. Now, this is especially great if you have a tile bitmap that is of the correct aspect ratio, but is otherwise too big or too small to fit the tile. If you go with stretch in this case, it'll just fit it into the tile for you by either making it smaller or bigger. Now, if per tile is your tile mapping of choice, then what you can do is you can plug all those individual tile bitmaps into a Corona multi-shader. In there, you can set your randomized by/distribution method to tile ID so that your bitmaps get more randomly applied on your tiles. And then you can plug everything into the tile color slot. This way you can achieve really cool randomization of those tiles so that things don't repeat themselves every X tiles or so. Additionally, if you want even more randomization, consider plugging in a Corona mapping randomizer in the mix as well. In the mapping randomizer itself, you can go with tile ID and then just simply randomize the position and maybe even the rotation parameters. This way you'll really avoid repetition in your tiles, although this kind of a setup obviously doesn't work if you're after an exact look for each of your tiles, in which case, just forego the mapping randomizer. Now, one big note to make with the per tile mode that you do have to keep in mind is that in this instance, we would actually recommend you do not use Corona bitmaps for your tile textures. We suggest you load them up using the native C4D bitmap loader instead, because at the moment at least, there is a slight problem with the Corona bitmap and how it gets mapped in the per tile mode. So please do note that, and also note that we will be looking into improving this behavior. All right, but now we still have another tile mapping mode that we need to talk about here, and that is the center tile mapping mode. This thing basically takes whatever color value is at the complete center of the tile and then just applies the same color to the whole tile. And if that doesn't sound particularly interesting, well, this enables you to plug in a bitmap and then have shapes or forms drawn out on your entire tile setup, much like you see in the example image in front of you right now. So pretty useful stuff. Now, as we already mentioned, we are going to go with the original mapping mode because that's the mapping that we'll want in our particular scene here. And with that, as you can see, our tile's base color is all set up. Now, what is not necessarily all set up just yet is the gap color. And with the Corona tile map, you have control over that as well. And controlling the gap color is real easy. You just need to locate the gap color parameter, and then the color you input in here, well, then that's the color that your gaps/grouts are going to have. Okay, now just going with a uniform color, probably not the most realistic approach. So what we're going to do here instead is we're just going to take a bitmap that we have here, and we're just going to plug it into the gap color slot. And so now this bitmap is applied to those gaps, to those grouts. All right. At this point, a bit of a note. Whatever you're plugging into the gap color slot, it will always be mapped using the original mapping mode. Okay. So now, if, for example, you wanted to control how this thing tiles, okay, how the gap color sort of texture tiles, well, you could do that through the material tag itself. If you just up, for example, the length U and V values in here, well, then now we're going to be scaling this thing up. But unfortunately, what you're also going to see is that we're scaling up the tile color as well, because we are in that original mapping mode for the tile color, right? So this is then not going to work if you just want to scale up the gap color texture or whatever. Okay, so let's undo changing those length U and V parameters. And instead, what you can do here is you can just go into the Corona bitmap of your gap color, okay? And then in here, you can sort of expand this additional mapping rollout. And in here now, you see that you have individual controls that are going to just affect this bitmap. So if we want to 2x this, we're going to go with 200%. well, now you're going to see that this thing is going to be, well, just, it's going to tile differently. All right, so for us here, 50% value is going to be good. But the point here is that this way you can control how the mapping here or the tiling works for the gap color separate from the tile colors, okay? Now, for when it comes to playing with your grouts/gaps, okay, there's another important functionality here that you definitely should play around with, and that is the gap distortion functionality. If you take a look at our gaps right now, you can see that they're basically perfect craftsmanship. They're totally straight, etc., etc. But in reality, obviously, that's not always the case, right? You want to have some imperfections, and in those situations, you're going to want to leverage this gap distortion functionality. Okay, so the main thing you're going to need for it is some sort of an imperfection map. We have this one right here, and what we're going to do with it, we're just going to plug it into the gap distortion input slot here. Okay, so just like this. And now, as you can see, those gaps are a lot less perfect. Now, the main parameter here for your gap distortion is the scale parameter. If you increase the scale, maybe to 2 centimeters, right, you can see that that's going to scale up the effect. And if you lower the scale, it's really going to lower it by quite a bit. Okay, you can still see that these gaps are a lot more imperfect than they were before, but the scale is just different now that we're using a lower scale. Nate's from the future here. Hi. Just to maybe offer another explanation of the scale parameter here, it basically specifies the maximum gap distortion in scene units. So I guess you can kind of sort of think of it basically for how many centimeters, in our case, the distortion map has an effect for. But at this point, it's worth noting that for when it comes to tweaking your gap distortions, there's a couple of different parameters that you're probably going to want to tweak whenever you're, trying to come up with that perfect gap distortion that you have in mind, basically. Okay, so let's just maybe reset the scale parameter to its default. And let's increase the gap thickness here to maybe 2 centimeters. Okay, so now that our gaps are a lot thicker, you can see that the gap distortion is a lot more prominent, and we can kind of see better as to how things are getting distorted. So the gap thickness is going to be a parameter that you're probably going to want to tweak for whenever you're trying to come up with your gap distortion as well. So now if we lower the scale down to 0.1 centimeters, as you can see, right, we're just getting different looks. And so the combo of these two parameters here is pretty potent. But then if you want to adjust, or if you go into your distortion imperfection map and you adjust the tiling here, okay, that's also going to affect things for you. So now we went with this really high tiling value here, and as you can see, there's now repetition with our happening in our sort of in terms of how this map is applied. We can see a lot of it, repetition on those gaps, gap distortions, right? But what you can also observe is that because this is tiling a lot more now, this imperfection map, it almost appears like the frequency of these distortions is a lot higher, right? So that's also how you can kind of use the parameters inside, sort of the additional mapping parameters inside your imperfection map here as well. Now, in this case, probably not what you want. So, typically for when it comes to tweaking your gap distortion, you want to play around with the scale, maybe with the gap thickness, and then also with how your imperfection map is mapped. One thing to note with the imperfection map here is that it is always mapped using the original mapping mode. So that's pretty important because, if you want to control how much the distortion map tiles and don't want to change how the tile color or gap color maps tile, well, then you want to change the tiling inside the gap distortion map itself, and don't do that through the material tag, right? Because that's obviously going to change how the tile color map or the gap color maps will tile as well. And that is also why using the Corona bitmap here for your gap color and gap distortion is important, because it gives you that extra leverage to control how it is tiling, basically. Right, but now in our case here, we don't really want any distortions, or, we want our tile setup to be kind of spotless. So we'll just basically disable all of the distortions. And now with that, we've basically concluded the base color setup for our tiles. And what we're going to focus on next here is going to be the bump effect. And, we're going to tweak the reflections a little bit. Now, before we start tackling how the bump effect works with the tile map, just a bit of a note, okay? If you have your tile map set up like this, right, and you want to use it, you don't have anything plugged into it, and you want to use it as a sort of as a bump map, okay? You have it plugged into that bump slot. You're not going to be able to see any type of a bump effect come through. This is unfortunately at this moment a limitation. We're going to look into improving the behavior here, but at the moment, this is the limitation. A slight workaround is that if you're in UVW space and you put a filter shader in between, sort of like this, then you're going to be able to see that effect come through. But this only works whenever you're in the UVW space, okay? Now, that said, if you do have bump maps or normal maps or whatever, you can plug them into the tile color slot like this, and then you're going to see the bump effect come through. Okay. And if you have something for the gap color bump imperfections as well, just plug it in there. And as you can see, the bump effect now is working great. It's just that whenever you just have the empty tile map plugged into the bump slot, then there's a bit of a limitation right there. And with that explained, let's just hop back into our scene and let's start playing with the bump effect for our setup. So to set up our bump effect, what we're going to do first here is we're going to take our existing tile map, okay, and we're just going to duplicate it by holding down Control or Command if you're on Mac. We're just going to duplicate it so that it retains all the same settings. That's kind of going to be key for us here. And then we're just going to take this normal map. We're obviously also going to need a Corona normal map shader here. We're just going to set this up like it should be set up, right? And then we're going to plug the tile normal map here into the tile color slot of the secondary tile map that we've created here. Then we can just plug this thing into the bump slot in our material and make sure that the bump effect is actually enabled. So at this point, all we have to do really is we just have to tweak the bump strength so that we get it looking the way we want it to look like. Now, if we want to set up the bump effect for our gaps as well, well, then what we can do here is we can just take the gap normal map. Okay, so this is just the accompanying normal map to the diffuse bitmap that we have right here for our gap color. Okay, and we can just plug it into the gap color slot in the second tile map. So the way that you can think about this is that this tile map here is basically controls sort of the diffuse properties of your material. And here you plug your diffuse maps, your albedo maps, etc., right? And then this tile map right here, this is where you plug in your basically your bump effect. Okay, your normal maps, your bump maps. So one goes into the tile color, that one's going to correspond to the tiles, and the other one goes into the gap color, which is going to correspond to the gap input there. Okay. All right. Okay. Now the same workflow applies to when you're setting up your reflections as well. What we're going to do here is we're just going to take one of these existing tile maps, okay, and we're going to duplicate it again. Then we're going to take our tile roughness / glossiness map, whatever you're using, right? And we're just going to plug it into the tile color slot of this new tile map. And then we can plug the entire setup into the roughness slot of our material. Okay. Now, if we want to control the reflection imperfections of our gaps as well, well, then we can just take our gap glossiness map or roughness map, and we can just plug it into the gap color slot in this new tile map as well. And so now we're adding some imperfections to those gaps as well. Now, if you want even more control than this, what you can, for example, do here, right, is you can bring in a Corona color mix shader, okay, kind of connect it in like that, and then you have even more control over those reflection imperfections. And again, remember the setup here, if we just quickly recap it, is this tile map up here kind of controls the diffuse / albedo properties of your material. This tile map here controls the bump imperfections, and this tile map here controls the reflection imperfection of your tiles. Or if we're being more precise, your tile material. All right, and so with that, we're pretty much done with our setup. So what are we going to be doing next here for the remainder of this tutorial? We're going to be taking a look at some of the parameters that we still haven't touched on because they just weren't relevant for that particular scene. But these parameters are still very, very useful. Now, to simplify the showcase here of all these additional parameters, what we did, we just unplugged those roughness and bump setups because, otherwise if we were to change the gap thickness in one of these tile maps, we would have to change it in all of them. So just, to demo this a little bit quicker, we're just going to use one tile map here. Okay. And so the first parameter that we're going to take a look at is the pattern selection parameter. It's probably at the top of everyone's list because yes, you can select different tile patterns from the drop down list right here, right? It's that simple. Just pick the pattern that you like, and that's really all the science that there is to it. Now, if you don't like any of the patterns we've pre-made for you, well, you can also come up with your own one. Just set the tile pattern here to custom pattern, and then you can play with the formula down here to define your own custom patterns. Because this is a fairly deep topic, we will revisit this functionality in a later video, but in the meantime, if you just hover over this question mark here, you're going to get sort of a basic explanation of how the formula here works. Separate from the patterns, what you can also play around with is the random variation of your tiles. So what you can do is, for example, you can change the tile width and row height randomization, which will result in, each tile having a different size. Do note that the values you input in here are percentage values. And actually that holds true for all of the randomization parameters in here. Another thing you can play around with here is the random shrinking of tiles in both their U and V directions, which you can basically think of their width and height. Okay, this works very similarly to what we did before with the tile width and row height randomization, but this time around, the tiles will change in size and the empty space, as you can see, will get filled with gaps. Now, that's not all, because you can also play around with the offsets in the U and V directions, which means that the individual tiles will get offset in either the U and V directions or, both, if you set them to both. But here's the kicker. The value you input in here basically says how much the tile can move into the gap space. So to better demonstrate this, let's just increase the gap thickness to 2 centimeters. Okay, and now if we just reset the length U and V parameters, you're going to be able to see that all of the tiles have sort of an equal amount of gap on all of their sides, right? Now, if we change the offset U to say maybe 80%, you're going to be able to see that the tiles will get offset and they will eat into that gap space. So that's how this parameter, or these two parameters here, work. Basically, if we can just put it in another way, if we set a value of 80% here, that would mean that the tile can move up to 80% into the gap thickness itself. Last but not least, you can also rotate the tiles a bit with the rotation parameter. So if we just input a value in here, let's say we go with 80%, well, then now you're going to be able to see that, the tiles are rotating. Anything less than the value of 80%, and the tiles are going to rotate less than that, and anything more than that, and the tiles are going to kind of rotate even more than that. And remember, this is tile randomization, so some tiles are going to be more randomized, others less. One thing maybe to note with the rotation parameter is that, as you can see, when the tiles rotate, they will eat into the gap thickness itself as well. Okay, so that can get you some really cool looking setups. Now, before we conclude this tutorial, maybe just a bit of a bonus round. Let's just quickly go over this epic and relatively easy setup by Romulus, just to give you some sort of an idea of how fun it can be playing around with the tile map. So for the tiles, you'd probably want to set the width and height, to what you want. And then you can also give those tile corners some radius adjustments. And while you're at it, you can also increase the gap thickness so there is, more room for stuff to grow between the individual tiles / stone blocks. Then, obviously, you can plug in textures for the tile and gap color. In this case, the gap color, for example, is a ground texture, or actually a mixture of a couple textures, really just for that extra realism's sake. And for the reflective and bump properties of the material, well, you can see these additional tile maps here that are basically they're an identical copy of the original tile map. And so this way you can kind of rest assured that you have all the tile size and gap settings and all that set up like it is set up in that original tile map. Into one of these, we've plugged in our roughness map for the tiles and the gaps, while the other tile map, the other copy, it got the normal map treatment, again for the tiles and the gaps. Then there is also an additional copied tile map here that you've probably noticed, and this one is driving the displacement for the tiles and the gaps. Now, for the scattering part, what Romulus here did was he just created a black and white version of the original tile map, okay, and used that as a distribution map for the scatter. So white part is where things are going to get scattered, and black part is where things are not going to get scattered. And that's really all that there is to it. That's how you can create similar setups yourself. Also, thank you, Romulus, for the share here. All right, and with that, we are concluding this tutorial. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you've learned something new, and until next time, take care, everybody.